You need to go to the hospital immediately. Your life depends on it. The desperate words of Grace Thompson, a 43-year-old African-American housekeeper, echoed through the marble corridors of the Manhattan penthouse belonging to Khalid al-Mansouri, one of New York's wealthiest oil magnates. The 50-year-old businessman, worth over $3 billion, looked at her with a mixture of irritation and disbelief as he adjusted his $15,000 Rolex. Grace had been cleaning his luxurious home for 6 years, always quiet, always efficient, invisible to the endless parade of politicians, celebrities, and business moguls who frequented his parties. But today, something in her voice made him pause, even though every fiber of his privileged existence told him to dismiss her concerns. "Mr. Al-Mansouri," Grace continued, her voice trembling with urgency, "I've been watching you for weeks. The way you hold your chest when you think no one is looking, the shortness of breath when you climb the stairs, the way you've been rubbing your left arm during phone calls. These aren't just signs of stress from business deals." Khalid laughed, a sound that carried decades of condescension toward people he considered beneath his social status. "Grace, you clean my house beautifully, but I hardly think a woman who never finished high school is qualified to give medical advice to someone who has access to the best doctors in the country." He gestured toward his Italian leather briefcase filled with documents for a meeting that would determine the future of a $500 million oil contract. "I have a meeting with Japanese investors in 1 hour. I don't have time for your domestic worker fantasies." Grace felt the familiar sting of humiliation that had followed her throughout her life. Born in Detroit to a teenage mother, she had dropped out of high school at 16 to care for her sick grandmother, never having the opportunity to pursue the nursing career she had dreamed of since childhood. But 43 years of life had taught her to recognize things that others missed, and what she was seeing in Khalid al-Mansouri terrified her. "Sir," she insisted, stepping between him and the door, "my grandmother died of a heart attack because no one listened to the warning signs. My brother died of the same thing at 38. I know what a heart attack looks like before it happens, and you are having one right now." Khalid's face flushed with anger. "How dare you block my path? You're fired. Pack your things and get out of my house immediately." But as he tried to push past her, something unprecedented happened. Grace Thompson, the invisible housekeeper who had spent 6 years apologizing for her presence, stood firm. She planted her feet on the marble floor and looked directly into the eyes of one of the most powerful men in New York. "I'm not moving until you call 911. She said with a determination that surprised them both. "You can fire me, you can call security, you can destroy my life, but I will not let you die on my watch because you're too proud to listen to a black housekeeper." The tension in the room was electric. Khalid had built his empire on the premise that money could buy anything, including people's obedience. No employee had ever defied him so directly. But there was something in Grace's eyes, a maternal fierceness that reminded him uncomfortably of his own mother, who had died when he was 12. For a moment, just a moment, his arrogance wavered. What Grace didn't know was that Khalid had indeed been experiencing strange symptoms for weeks, symptoms he had attributed to stress from international business negotiations. What he didn't know was that Grace Thompson wasn't just any housekeeper. She was a woman who had spent 20 years caring for sick family members, who had taught herself to recognize medical symptoms through necessity and tragedy, and who had saved 3 lives in her neighborhood by insisting people seek medical attention when everyone else dismissed the warning signs. If you're feeling the same tension as Khalid right now, wondering whether to trust the wisdom of someone society has taught us to ignore, subscribe to the channel because what happens next will change everything you believe about expertise, intuition, and the value of human life over social status. As Khalid stared at Grace, his phone rang. It was his personal assistant, Patricia, calling to confirm the location of his meeting with the Japanese investors. But when he tried to answer, something strange happened. His left arm felt heavy, almost numb. The sensation was subtle but undeniable, and for the first time in weeks, he acknowledged what his body had been trying to tell him. Grace saw the moment of recognition in his eyes. She had seen that exact expression on her brother Marcus's face just hours before his heart attack. The realization that something was seriously wrong followed immediately by the stubborn male pride that insisted it was nothing. "Sir," Grace said softly, her voice now gentle rather than confrontational, I'm not trying to embarrass you or make you look weak. I'm trying to save your life because I care about you as a human being, not because of your money or your status." She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small notebook, worn and filled with her careful handwriting. For 6 years, she had been documenting everything she observed in the households where she worked. A habit she had developed after her grandmother's death taught her that details others ignored could be matters of life and death. "Mr. Al-Mansouri," she read from her notes, "October 3rd, you paused halfway up the main staircase and held the railing for 30 seconds. October 7th, during the dinner party, you excused yourself to the bathroom 3 times and I saw you taking deep breaths in the hallway. October 10th, you left your meeting with the oil executives early, claiming fatigue. October 15th, your personal trainer called to say you canceled your workout session for the 3rd time this month." Khalid listened in shock as Grace recited a detailed medical history he hadn't even realized he was creating. The woman he had dismissed as intellectually inferior had been conducting a more thorough health assessment than his own doctor. "How do you remember all of this?" he asked, his voice losing its hostile edge. "Because," Grace replied simply, "when you grow up poor and black in Detroit, you learn that no one else is going to pay attention to your health except you. You learn to notice things because missing them can mean death. My grandmother taught me that the body always tells the truth, even when people lie to themselves." She closed the notebook and looked at him with genuine concern. "You have classic symptoms of unstable angina, possibly progressing to myocardial infarction. In simple terms, your heart isn't getting enough blood, and if you don't get medical attention right now, you could have a massive heart attack during your meeting with those investors." At that moment, as if summoned by some cosmic irony, Khalid felt a sharp pain shoot down his left arm, followed by a crushing sensation in his chest. The business documents scattered across the marble floor as he grabbed the nearest chair for support. Grace didn't hesitate. She pulled out her cell phone and dialed 911 with the efficiency of someone who had done it before. "This is Grace Thompson at the Al-Mansouri residence on 5th Avenue, she said calmly to the dispatcher. "We need an ambulance immediately. 50-year-old male experiencing chest pain, shortness of breath, and left arm numbness. Possible myocardial infarction in progress." Khalid stared at her in amazement. Not only had she accurately diagnosed his condition, but she was communicating with emergency services using precise medical terminology. "Where did you learn to talk to paramedics like that?" he gasped between waves of chest pain. 23 years of emergency calls for my family," Grace replied, loosening his tie and helping him sit down properly. "My mother had diabetes, my brother had heart disease, my aunt had strokes. When you can't afford private doctors, you learn to be your own first responder." The ambulance arrived within 7 minutes, but those 7 minutes changed everything. As the paramedics confirmed Grace's assessment and prepared Khalid for transport to Mount Sinai Hospital, he grabbed her hand with surprising strength. "Grace," he whispered, his voice heavy with medication and regret. I'm sorry for dismissing you, for treating you like you were invisible, for assuming that education and intelligence are the same thing." The paramedics confirmed that he was indeed having a heart attack, but because Grace had recognized the symptoms early and insisted on immediate medical attention, they were able to administer treatment that would save his life and minimize damage to his heart muscle. In the ambulance, as they rushed through Manhattan traffic, Khalid made a decision that would transform both their lives forever. He told the paramedic to call his lawyer and dictate a message that would be legally binding. "I, Khalid Al-Mansouri, wanted on record that Grace Thompson saved my life today through her medical knowledge and persistence. She demonstrated expertise that my own doctors missed, and I owe her a debt that money cannot repay." What neither of them knew was that this incident would expose a web of medical negligence and insurance fraud that reached the highest levels of New York's healthcare system, and that Grace Thompson's street-smart medical knowledge would soon be pitted against some of the most expensive doctors in the country in a battle that would determine not just Khalid's recovery, but the futures of thousands of patients who had been failed by a system that valued credentials over competence. At Mount Sinai Hospital, Dr. Richard Whitman, Khalid's personal physician and one of New York's most expensive cardiologists, arrived with the confidence of a man who charged $5,000 for consultations. The 60-year-old doctor, with his perfectly groomed silver hair and $15,000 suit, had been treating Manhattan's elite for over 20 years. He immediately dismissed Grace's presence in the waiting room, assuming she was simply domestic help with no relevant information. "Mr. Al-Mansouri," Dr. Whitman said, reviewing the chart with a condescending smile. "You've had a minor cardiac episode, probably brought on by business stress. We'll keep you overnight for observation, prescribe some medication, and you'll be back to your normal activities within a week." But Grace, who had remained quietly in the corner of the hospital room, stood up abruptly. "That's not what the paramedics said," she interrupted, causing both men to turn and stare at her in surprise. "They said he had ST elevation in leads 2, 3, and AVF, indicating an inferior wall myocardial infarction with possible right ventricular involvement." Dr. Whitman's jaw dropped. A housekeeper was contradicting his diagnosis using advanced cardiology terminology that most nursing students wouldn't know. "Where exactly?" he asked with barely concealed irritation. "Did you learn cardiac electrophysiology?" "From watching my brother die," Grace replied quietly, "while doctors like you told our family it was just indigestion. Marcus had the exact same EKG pattern, the same enzyme elevation, the same troponin levels that Mr. Al-Mansouri has right now. The difference is that Marcus was a 40-year-old black auto worker without insurance, so the hospital sent him home with antacids. He died 6 hours later." The room fell silent except for the beeping of Khalid's heart monitor. Dr. Whitman glanced at the EKG strip, and for the first time his confidence wavered. The pattern Grace described was indeed present, but he had attributed it to artifacts from the patient's anxiety rather than actual cardiac damage. "Nurse," Dr. Whitman called out, his voice slightly strained, "please run another 12-lead EKG and cardiac enzymes stat." The results came back within an hour, confirming exactly what Grace had predicted. Khalid hadn't had a minor cardiac episode. He had suffered a significant heart attack that required immediate surgical intervention. Without Grace's early detection and insistence on emergency care, he would have likely suffered massive cardiac damage or death. But that wasn't the end of the story. As Dr. Whitman prepared for emergency cardiac catheterization, Grace pulled out her worn notebook again and approached Khalid's bedside. "Sir?" she said quietly. "There's something else you need to know. This isn't the first time Dr. Whitman has misdiagnosed a heart attack." Khalid, despite his pain and medication, focused on her words. "What are you talking about?" Grace opened her notebook to a section she had hoped never to use. "For 6 years, I've been cleaning houses in this neighborhood. Rich families talk in front of their housekeepers like we're furniture. I've heard conversations about misdiagnosed heart attacks, about patients who died because Dr. Whitman convinced them their symptoms were psychological, about families who couldn't sue because they couldn't prove negligence." She showed him pages of careful notes, dates, names, conversations she had overheard while cleaning the homes of Manhattan's elite. Mrs. Harrison on East 72nd Street died of a heart attack 3 weeks after Dr. Whitman told her husband it was anxiety. Mr. Chen from the penthouse on Park Avenue had his second heart attack during a business meeting after Dr. Whitman said his chest pains were stress-related. At least 7 people that I know of personally. Khalid stared at the notebook in disbelief. "You've been documenting medical malpractice for 6 years. Why didn't you report it? Who would believe a black housekeeper with no medical degree over one of the most respected cardiologists in Manhattan?" Grace replied simply. "But now you know the truth. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" As if summoned by their conversation, Doctor. Whitman returned with the catheterization results, his face grave. "Mr. Al-Mansouri," he announced, "you have a 90% blockage in your right coronary artery. We need to perform an emergency angioplasty immediately. Without surgery, you have a significant risk of another, possibly fatal heart attack within hours." Khalid looked from Dr. Whitman to Grace, then made a decision that would reverberate throughout New York's medical establishment. "Dr. Whitman," he said with the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed, "you're fired. I want a different cardiologist, and I want Grace Thompson to be present for all medical discussions going forward. She's demonstrated better diagnostic skills than you have, and unlike you, she actually cares whether I live or die." Dr. Whitman's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "Mr. Al-Mansouri, you're making a mistake. This woman has no medical training, no credentials, no legal standing to participate in your medical care. She's a housekeeper, for God's sake. And you," Khalid replied coldly, "are a doctor who just nearly killed me through incompetence. The difference is that she's been right about everything, while you've been wrong about everything that matters. Security will escort you out." I never want to see you again. What happened next would expose the largest medical malpractice cover-up in New York history and transform Grace Thompson from an invisible domestic worker into one of the most respected patient advocates in the country. But first, Khalid al-Mansouri had to survive the night, and the only person he trusted to make sure that happened was a woman he had nearly fired that morning for caring too much about his life. Dr. Sarah Chen, the cardiac surgeon who took over Khalid's case, was initially skeptical when she learned that a housekeeper had been the first to correctly diagnose his condition. But after reviewing Grace's detailed notes and comparing them to the actual test results, her skepticism turned to professional admiration. In 20 years of cardiac surgery, Dr. Chen said to Grace privately, "I've rarely seen such accurate pre-hospital assessment, even from trained paramedics. Your observations may have saved not just his life, but prevented massive cardiac damage that could have left him disabled." The surgery was successful, but during Khalid's recovery, Grace made a discovery that would change everything. While researching Dr. Whitman's background for the inevitable malpractice lawsuit, she uncovered something that made her blood run cold. Dr. Whitman had been systematically misdiagnosing heart attacks in wealthy patients, then steering them toward expensive, unnecessary procedures at a private cardiac center where he held a financial stake. The patients who died from misdiagnosis were written off as unfortunate cases of sudden cardiac death, while those who survived unnecessary procedures generated millions in revenue. But there was more. Grace found evidence that Dr. Whitman had been specifically targeting older, wealthy patients with vague cardiac symptoms, convincing them they needed expensive preventive procedures while ignoring actual heart attacks in younger or less affluent patients. It was a scheme that had been generating over $10 million annually in fraudulent billing. When Khalid was finally stable enough for visitors, Grace presented him with a folder containing 3 years of documentation. "Sir," she said quietly, "Dr. Whitman didn't just misdiagnose you. He's been running a systematic insurance fraud operation that has killed at least 12 people that I can document, possibly more." Khalid reviewed the evidence with growing horror. The same attention to detail that had saved his life had uncovered a criminal conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of New York's medical establishment. "Grace," he said finally, his voice heavy with emotion, "you don't just clean houses, do you? You investigate them." "For 6 years," she admitted, "I've been documenting everything I see and hear in wealthy households. Originally, it was just for my own protection, to have evidence if I was ever falsely accused of theft or misconduct. But over time, I realized I was witnessing things that needed to be reported: medical malpractice, insurance fraud, elder abuse, domestic violence. The problem was always the same. Who would believe the word of a black housekeeper against wealthy, powerful people?" Khalid looked at her with newfound respect. "You've been conducting undercover investigations for 6 years, gathering evidence of crimes that the authorities couldn't detect because they don't have access to private homes and private conversations." "Exactly," Grace nodded. "The wealthy think domestic workers are invisible, so they say and do things in front of us that they would never admit to investigators or journalists. I have evidence of corruption, fraud, and abuse that could put dozens of powerful people in prison, but I've never had anyone with enough influence to bring it to light." At that moment, Khalid al-Mansouri made a decision that would transform the criminal justice system's approach to white-collar crime. He picked up his phone and called the most powerful attorney in New York. "Marcus," he said to his lawyer, "I need you to arrange meetings with the FBI, the district attorney's office, and the medical board. I have a witness whose testimony is going to expose the largest healthcare fraud conspiracy in state history, and I'm going to make sure she has the resources and protection to tell her story." What Grace had discovered was that Dr. Whitman was just one part of a massive network of medical professionals, insurance companies, and hospital administrators who had been systematically defrauding Medicare, Medicaid, and private insurance companies while providing substandard care to patients based on their race, age, and social status. The evidence Grace had collected would ultimately lead to the arrest of 47 medical professionals, the closure of 3 fraudulent medical centers, and the recovery of over $200 million in fraudulent billing. But more importantly, it would save the lives of thousands of future patients who would receive proper medical care instead of being victimized by a system that prioritized profit over human life. 2 months after Khalid's heart attack, Grace Thompson walked into the FBI field office in Manhattan not as a domestic worker, but as the star witness in the largest medical fraud case in New York history. She carried with her 6 years of meticulous documentation that would bring down some of the most powerful people in the city's medical establishment. Agent Rodriguez, the lead investigator, had initially been skeptical when Khalid's attorney contacted the bureau about a housekeeper who had uncovered a massive conspiracy. But after reviewing Grace's evidence, his skepticism turned to amazement. "Mrs. Thompson," Agent Rodriguez said, studying her notebooks filled with dates, conversations, and detailed observations, "you've conducted a more thorough investigation than teams of federal agents typically accomplish in years of work. Your documentation is so detailed and accurate that we'll be able to obtain search warrants for dozens of locations and financial records." The federal investigation that followed Grace's testimony was swift and devastating. Dr. Whitman was arrested at his Upper East Side clinic while performing an unnecessary cardiac procedure on an 82-year-old patient who had been told he was at risk of immediate heart attack when his actual test results showed perfectly normal cardiac function. When federal agents seized the clinic's computers and financial records, they found evidence of systematic fraud dating back over a decade. Dr. Whitman had been billing insurance companies for procedures that were never performed, performing unnecessary surgeries on healthy patients, and deliberately misdiagnosing conditions to justify expensive treatments. Most shocking of all, he had been using a sophisticated computer algorithm to identify wealthy patients with good insurance coverage who could be targeted for fraudulent billing. But Dr. Whitman was just the beginning. Grace's evidence led to the discovery of an entire network of corrupt medical professionals who had been systematically exploiting the healthcare system. Dr. Patricia Williams, the chief administrator at Manhattan General Hospital, had been accepting kickbacks for referring patients to Dr. Whitman's clinic. Insurance executive Robert Chen had been approving fraudulent claims in exchange for a percentage of the profits. Even some of New York's most prestigious medical institutions were involved in the scheme. The trial became a media sensation when Grace took the witness stand. Here was a woman who had never gone to medical school, testifying with expertise that surpassed trained physicians, exposing crimes that had gone undetected by regulatory agencies for years. The defense attorneys tried to discredit her testimony by emphasizing her lack of formal education, but their strategy backfired when Grace calmly explained how she had taught herself medical terminology and diagnostic criteria through necessity and tragedy. When you've watched 3 family members die from conditions that doctors missed or misdiagnosed, Grace testified, you learn to educate yourself. When you can't afford private health care, you become your own medical advocate. When you're invisible to the people committing crimes around you, you learn to document everything because someday, someone might finally be willing to listen. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Dr. Whitman was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison and ordered to pay over $50 million in restitution. 12 other medical professionals received sentences ranging from 5 to 15 years. The corrupt insurance executives were ordered to pay back over $100 million in fraudulent claims. But the real victory came when Khalid al-Mansouri announced the establishment of the Grace Thompson Medical Advocacy Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to training community health advocates and providing resources for patients who couldn't afford private medical care. Grace was named the foundation's executive director, with a salary that finally reflected the value of her expertise and dedication. The foundation's first initiative was to create a network of community health advocates who would be trained to recognize medical symptoms and help patients navigate the healthcare system. The program was designed to address the healthcare disparities that had nearly cost Khalid his life and had actually claimed the lives of Grace's family members. Within 6 months, the Grace Thompson Medical Advocacy Foundation had trained over 500 community health advocates in neighborhoods across New York City. These advocates, many of them women of color with personal experience navigating healthcare challenges, were positioned to identify medical emergencies and healthcare fraud in communities that had been systematically underserved by the medical establishment. A year after Khalid's heart attack, Grace received a call that brought tears to her eyes. It was Maria Santos, a woman from the South Bronx who had attended one of the foundation's training programs. "Mrs. Thompson, Maria said excitedly. "I just wanted to thank you. Last week, I recognized the symptoms of a stroke in my neighbor, an elderly man whose doctor had been telling him his confusion and weakness were just signs of aging. I insisted he go to the emergency room, and the doctors confirmed he was having a stroke. Because we caught it early, he's going to make a full recovery." The foundation had now documented over 200 cases where community health advocates had correctly identified serious medical conditions that had been missed or dismissed by healthcare professionals. Even more importantly, they had identified and reported 17 cases of medical fraud, leading to additional investigations and prosecutions. Grace's story had inspired a movement that was transforming healthcare advocacy across the country. Medical schools began incorporating her diagnostic methods into their training programs. Community colleges started offering courses based on her expertise. Politicians cited her example when arguing for healthcare reform that would give patients more power and protection against medical fraud. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. The American Medical Association, the same organization that had initially dismissed her as unqualified to provide medical opinions, awarded Grace Thompson their highest honor for patient advocacy. In her acceptance speech, she dedicated the award to her brother Marcus and all the other patients who had died because their symptoms were ignored or dismissed by a healthcare system that valued credentials over compassion. 3 years after saving Khalid al-Mansouri's life, Grace Thompson stood before a congressional committee investigating healthcare fraud and disparities. She was no longer the invisible housekeeper who cleaned the homes of the wealthy. She was now one of the most respected patient advocates in the country, whose testimony would help shape national healthcare policy. Congressman Williams, the committee chairman, began the hearing with a question that had become central to the healthcare reform debate. Mrs. Thompson, in your expert opinion, how many lives could be saved if we trained community health advocates to recognize medical emergencies and healthcare fraud in underserved communities? Grace looked out at the packed hearing room, filled with medical professionals, patients' rights advocates, and family members of people who had died from preventable medical errors. She thought about her brother Marcus, who had died because no one listened to his symptoms. She thought about Khalid al-Mansouri, who had almost died because he was too proud to listen to a housekeeper's concerns. She thought about the hundreds of people whose lives had been saved by community health advocates trained through her foundation. Based on our experience in New York, she replied, we could prevent at least 30% of deaths from misdiagnosed heart attacks, strokes, and other emergency conditions. More importantly, we could identify healthcare fraud that costs the system billions of dollars annually and puts patients at risk. The committee's final report recommended the establishment of community health advocate programs in every state, funded by recovered fraudulent billing money and supported by partnerships between community organizations and medical institutions. The Grace Thompson model, as it became known, was implemented nationwide within 2 years. The program's success exceeded everyone's expectations. Community health advocates identified and prevented thousands of medical emergencies, exposed dozens of healthcare fraud schemes, and provided a bridge between underserved communities and the medical establishment. Most importantly, they demonstrated that expertise could come from experience and dedication, not just formal education and credentials. Khalid al-Mansouri, whose life had been saved by Grace's intervention, became one of the program's largest financial supporters. He established clinics in underserved communities where community health advocates worked alongside trained medical professionals, creating a model of healthcare that valued both clinical expertise and community wisdom. The transformation in Khalid's own life was equally dramatic. The heart attack had forced him to reevaluate his priorities and his assumptions about intelligence, value, and human worth. He sold his oil company and invested the proceeds in renewable energy and healthcare initiatives, becoming an advocate for social justice rather than simply accumulating wealth. But he never forgot the lesson that Grace Thompson had taught him, that wisdom and expertise could come from the most unexpected sources, and that dismissing someone based on their social status or background could literally be a matter of life and death. On the 5th anniversary of his heart attack, Khalid hosted a celebration dinner at his penthouse, the same location where Grace had first confronted him about his symptoms. But this time, Grace wasn't there as a housekeeper. She was the guest of honor, surrounded by the hundreds of lives she had saved through her advocacy work and the thousands more who had been helped by the program she had created. In his toast, Khalid reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. 5 years ago, he said, raising his glass, I was a man who thought that money could buy intelligence, that education could purchase wisdom, and that social status determined human value. Grace Thompson saved more than my life that day. She saved my soul. She taught me that the most important expertise is the kind that comes from caring about other people's well-being more than your own reputation. Grace responded with characteristic humility. The real heroes, she said, are the community health advocates working in neighborhoods across the country, the family members who refuse to accept that their loved one's symptoms are imaginary, and the patients who insist on being heard even when the system tries to silence them. We've proven that everyone has the capacity to save lives if we're willing to listen, learn, and care enough to act. The evening concluded with the announcement of the Grace Thompson Institute for Community Health, a research and training center that would continue to develop innovative approaches to healthcare advocacy and fraud prevention. The Institute's motto, carved in marble above the entrance, captured the essence of Grace's philosophy. Wisdom comes not from credentials, but from compassion. Expertise is earned through experience, not education. Every person has the power to save lives if they have the courage to speak up and the determination to be heard. Grace Thompson had started as an invisible housekeeper whose observations were dismissed because of her race and social status. She became a nationally recognized expert whose methods revolutionized healthcare advocacy and saved thousands of lives. Her story proved that the most profound expertise often comes from those whom society overlooks, and that the courage to speak truth to power, even when that truth is inconvenient or uncomfortable, can literally be the difference between life and death. Khalid al-Mansouri tried to dismiss the wisdom of a woman he considered beneath his notice, but ended up discovering that she possessed knowledge that his expensive doctors lacked. Grace Thompson turned years of personal tragedy and systematic discrimination into a movement that transformed healthcare for millions of people. If this story of overlooked wisdom and life-saving courage has moved you, remember that there are Grace Thompsons in every community, people whose insights and dedication could save lives if we had the humility to listen and the wisdom to value expertise wherever it originates.